Now, I'm of the generation that that first experienced Sputnik and was excited by the birth and growth of NASA and the moon landing. Of course, I applied to be an astronaut, but didn't make the cut. I did have the privilege of working at NASA's Jet Propulsion Lab on the design of the experiment on the subsequent Viking Mars lander, searching for microbial life on the Mars surface. This entailed a season in the dry valleys of the Antarctic, the closest environment to Mars on Earth. Now, as with millions of other Americans, I watched movies that featured the astronauts, read many biographies, but they were all of astronauts who came from military jet pilot backgrounds. When I first saw the Roz Cooper film, I realized that the lives of civilian astronauts were less well known. And in fact, I was embarrassed that I didn't even know that one of them was an MIT colleague. So this is one little effort to correct that. And
It's Shabbat morning in Jerusalem and Shabbat evening back in Houston, Texas. This is a very special Shabbat in space.
In the 50s, when I was a little boy, instead of playing Cowboys and Indians, I used to play Space Raiders with my best friend. Actually, when I became an astronaut, he came to my first launch and he said he couldn't believe that the little boy that he had played Space Rangers with is now going up into space.
We astronauts are human beings, and when we travel, like all explorers, we bring with us parts of our culture, our history, our traditions.
When people ask what was the most significant thing that I felt I ever did, I would always say repairing the Hubble Space Telescope. I mean, Judaism has the tradition of tikkun olam, to repair the world. Without our care and attention, things deteriorate, and to fix them is an important mitzvah.
This is a special Torah, but I think a lot of people don't appreciate what it went through. It was sitting, along with me, of course, on top of 4.5 million pounds of high explosive. And then you light the fuse. About a minute into the flight, you break the sound barrier going straight up. And then after 2 minutes, the Torah and I were now in orbit.
Reading the book of Exodus, the revelation of Torah at Mount Sinai, and that somehow it came down from heaven to Moses. So now we have a Torah that went back to heaven.
There's this beautiful concept, Torah min hashamayim, Torah from heaven. The full phrase is Torah from heaven as refracted through generations.
It's something that goes back thousands of years, and yet this is something that we take with us also into the future, because as it says, you teach your children to read it and your children will teach their children, and that's how we keep going into the future.
Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Thea Keith Lucas. I serve as chaplain to the Institute here at MIT. We are in the Office of Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life. We are very honored to be part of this showing. I think it's so important to remember how we enrich each other's lives when we show up with our whole selves. And this is such a powerful example of the way that Dr. Hoffman was able to bring a scientific identity to enrich the Jewish community and the Jewish identity to enrich the scientific community. So thank you for this example of wholeness. So we're so glad to have our own Jeff Hoffman of MIT Aero Astro with us, as well as the director, Rob Cooper, and the executive producer, Raquel Raz. I'd like to invite those of you in attendance to use the Q&A box. Please share your questions.
While we're waiting for questions,
maybe people would be interested in hearing how this all came about. Briefly, maybe Rachel, you can relate. When I had an invitation, I had had this video made. One of my crewmates, Claude Nicollier, a Swiss astronaut, good friend, worked the camera while I was doing the little ceremony. And for about 20 years, it lived on my computer until I was invited to, well, Rachel, why don't you take the story from there?
Sure, I'd be delighted to. In 2016, I heard Jeff for the first time. He gave a lecture at Hebrew College where I worked. And for my surprise, his story was very inspiring, both professionally and personally. And he shared this original footage of 5 minutes from that space and the footage about the Hanukkah and some other things. And I'm an educator by profession, and there are several lines and several things in these videos and in the stories that I felt that are very important to spread and share with the world. Like one of them in particular that you saw here, you heard in the film, is when he said, we astronauts are human beings, and when we travel, like all explorer, we bring with us parts of our culture, our history, and our tradition. And it struck me how important it is to give this message to people all over the country and all over the world. And when I found out that this original footage is not available, but I knew that it must be a documentary film because we have this rich footage. I asked Jeff if he would be open to make a documentary film. And he was kind enough to say if it's done professionally. So yes, maybe it was a nice way to kind of dismiss but I'm very happy that he said yes. And for me, I never did any project that involved making of a film. So I was very fortunate that a friend connected me with Rob Cooper, our director and co-founder of Verissima production, that he has a very rich background of over 3 or 4 decades of making wonderful historical documentary educational film. And he took the lead of making the product that we see here today. So I'm very thankful for that. And the film was done in 2020, and since then played in over 40 film festivals in 10 countries. And I'm very delighted that we are able to share it here now at home with the Jeff community. And the idea is to inspire, bring this film to more and more communities and inspire people to bring their whole identity with them. So this is my little story of this journey that I wasn't expecting, and definitely took me out of this world.
Raquel, several folks have written in that they would like to share this film more widely with other communities. What's the best way for folks to get in contact with you?
I will put in the chat the link to our website and also my email. So I'm happy to hear from everyone.
Thank you.
And I think you should explain, Rachel, that at the moment, the distribution has to be somewhat limited as long as it's being submitted to film festivals. You can explain that.
Yeah, so a couple of things are happening with this time in the life of the film. It's playing in film festival, but parallel we can do what we call private screening, like the one that we're having today. So I've been doing this all over the globe with the schools, with the communities, with all age group. I would say probably from 2nd grade and up, and adult in communities, as I mentioned, all over the world. And I'm also working with the Ministry of Education in Israel to make it part of the curriculum. And there are still lots of ideas of how to share this film with more and more people. And eventually it probably will be open for everyone to see. But if you have any specific questions about showing it or getting a private link for a day or so, please be in touch. The idea is to really share it and inspire other people.
Thank you. Jeff, did you come away from this experience with your religious feelings changed? Did you feel differently about God or humanity?
I don't look at spaceflight as a sectarian experience in the sense of making me more Jewish, or a Catholic who goes up becomes more Catholic. We've had people from every major religion in the world, as well as atheists and agnostics, and to the extent that we talk about these things, I think the one almost universal reaction is a feeling of deep awe. You're in such a different environment. You have a completely different perspective on our home planet, a sense of you're surrounded by a vacuum. You sense the total hostility to life of almost the entire universe. And then you look back at the planet that has given birth to life and to us, and that sense of almost the miraculousness of life having evolved on our planet. And with that, I think, comes a sense also of the fragility of life when you look at all the other places in our solar system and the universe where life does not exist. And so I think a lot of astronauts, if there's a change in it, it's more a feeling about life and our relationship with our home planet, the Earth, and the need to value it and protect it, and to share that message with other people.
Have you found that there was openness among that community of astronauts coming from many different backgrounds to talking about the sort of spiritual experience of being in space?
I have to say, we didn't really spend a whole lot of time talking about spirituality or religion in the course of space flights. Maybe it's something that, back on Earth late at night over a glass of wine or something we might discuss, but things get pretty busy up there. And there are many times. I mean, I certainly remember an evening where we were just floating over Central Africa, and there's these absolutely incredible lightning storms going on, and one of my colleagues was looking out a window right next to me, and it was beyond words. After we moved away, we just sort of turned and looked at each other, and I knew what he was feeling, he knew what I was feeling, but it was beyond words.
Thank you. We are honored to have among our guests Courtney Stott, who produced another documentary, Space Shuttle Columbia Mission of Hope, about a Torah that Israeli astronaut Ilan Ramon took to space on, says, the ill-fated Columbia mission in 2003. And the question is, you as a filmmaking team, or as someone taking a Torah to space, were you aware of that previous Torah?
I can say, I mean, I knew Ilan. I had already moved on from the astronaut office by the time he flew, but through various visits, and he knew who I was as a Jewish astronaut, and of course I knew who he was. And I should say that Ilan, he was incredibly well accepted in the astronaut office, probably because of his skill as a pilot. I mean, he had done amazing things in the Israeli Air Force, and very, very popular. One, lovely human being, and what terrible tragedies, not just the loss of him, but in his family, his son, and so on. But yes, we had heard that he was taking a Torah with him, and what a tragedy that he never got to come back with it, and it was lost. Rachel, you can.
Yeah, I can add to it. I'm Israeli American, so knew about Ilan Ramon and was very proud as Israeli when he was selected, and we were all following his career. And I know that everyone in Israel, every day that they had experiment in space, were watching at school, and the story of this Torah that survived the Holocaust and came about, and he took it with him, was very powerful for Israelis and other around the world. And when I met Jeff, I was actually surprised to know. Until then, I thought actually that Ilan Ramon took the first Torah to space. And when I was sitting at that lecture and I realized that Jeff took the first Torah in 1996, and actually also on Space Shuttle Columbia, that was also one of the things that really struck me and kind of pushed me to think about making a film and tell this story, because there is also the positive story, you know, without the tragedy, to see that you can take it and celebrate your life and take it with you, and you can continue to have a thriving career and build a family. So that was also one of the reasons that it was important for me to tell Jeff's story. I think it was very important. And lastly, recently in 2019, Jeff and I, we presented parts of the film before it was done in Florida, and we met the sons of Ilan Ramon, and Jeff had the opportunity to sit with them and share with him some of his knowledge and experience with Jeff and being an astronaut. But I would love to see this film that she was mentioning. I would love to see it.
We also have a question of what do you think may be happening on station now? How can the future of space travel continue to create common ground for people?
I mean, we're in the midst of a horrendous tragedy in international affairs. There had been so much hope that despite all of our difficulties on the ground, we could still cooperate off the planet in space. There's been a lot of talk and speculation about, and I have to say quite honestly, some absolutely beyond the pale comments by the head of the Russian space agency about, you know, leaving an American astronaut stranded up in the station and so on. And by the way, he would be in no danger. The space station has plenty of supplies. You can live up there for a long time, but just the words that were coming out. But that's from the head of the Russian space agency, which is a political, you know, organization with relationships. They've got to maintain certain relationships with Putin, I assume. All the messages I'm getting from Houston, from my colleagues down there, is that the plans are going ahead for the return of 2 cosmonauts and Mark from NASA, from the space station. And they're doing their best to maintain the cooperation that we have up on the station. You know, what will happen due to things on the ground, I hesitate to make any prediction, because every prediction that people have made about what Russia would or would not do in the Ukraine seems to have not turned out the way we were hoping. And we'll just have to see what it means for the future long-term cooperation with Russia in space. It could be a very bad sign in terms of any future cooperation. But for now, the space station is in no danger, and none of the astronauts are in any danger. That's about all that I can say definitively at this time.
Thank you. Question: how do rabbis determine when Shabbat would start for a Jewish person in space?
The rabbis always seem to come up with an answer. I mean, this is not the first time that you have difficulty. You know, what do you do if you're up above the Arctic Circle and it's summertime and the sun never sets and never rises, since Jewish tradition goes by sunrise and sunset and so on? I was able, it just turned out. I mean, I couldn't have planned it better, but when I was doing the little ceremony, literally, it was Saturday morning, Shabbat morning in Jerusalem, and it was Friday evening, Shabbat evening, the beginning of the Sabbath in Houston. So it was a perfect time. Sometimes you just get lucky. Other than that, the fact that you are carrying out a ceremony or doing activities, I think, is more important than the specific time at which you start. And you just have to adapt. A lot of things have to change when you go up into space and you're going around the world 16 times every 24 hours. You don't keep the same kind of schedule, and you don't live your life by sunrise and sunset anymore. And so Jewish, as well as any other ceremonies that depend on timing, just are going to have to adapt.
Jeff, I'd like to ask you, coming back to MIT, what's it like living that life after the life you lived as an astronaut?
Going into space is certainly, it's a peak experience. It's not the only kind of peak experience that human beings have. I mean, what impact on your life does it have to climb Mount Everest, for instance, or artistically? I mean, to hear a beautiful piece of music or see a beautiful work of art for the first time is also a transformative experience. And how you carry it back into the rest of your life partly depends on your personality. I mean, the way I look at it, I've been incredibly fortunate to have the experiences that I did. I would be very foolish to try to match the excitement of space flight, in the rest of my life. But I have those memories, and I've been also very fortunate coming back here at MIT and one of the reasons I came back here was to be able to keep a contact with the space program. And, I've been very fortunate. I've worked on the design of new types of spacesuits with Professor David Newman. I'm deputy principal investigator now for the MOXIE experiment, which is producing oxygen on Mars as a kind of a demonstration of the technology we'll someday need when humans go to Mars. And I'm never going to get to Mars myself. Some of us, when we first became astronauts, we thought, maybe it was only a matter of a decade or two before we'd be going to Mars, and some of us would get to go. Well, that didn't happen. But we will get there someday, and it's nice to know that the experiment that I'm participating in is helping to set the stage for that. So, coming to MIT, it's been exciting. I mean, I love working with the students, got to do a lot of things and continue to make some contribution to the exploration of space, which I find still very exciting.
Thank you. I'd like to bring Director Rob Cooper into the conversation. Rob, what did you learn in the process of making this film?
Rob, you're muted. You're muted, Rob. Rob, you're muted.
Sorry.
There we go.
You muted again, Rob.
Rob, you're still
Try again. Muted again.
I'm supposed to be the person that, knows the production stuff. So
Happens to all of us.
yeah, I guess initiation. In my own life, my connection with my own Judaism had a lot to do with this project. My wife and I have run Verissima Productions for 20 years. We've done a film about a Jewish choral group, Zamir Chorale, that sang at Auschwitz and Terezin and other places, and the artist Samuel Bach. but I never had connected with the Jewishness that I was born into. And it's so interesting to me that when Jeff went up and made that home movie 25 years ago, he didn't know how many people it might touch. And one of them was Raquel and one of them was me. So I was fascinated, and we should give a shout out to Shaul Osadsky, who was Jeff's rabbi, whose idea this whole thing was in the first place. And if he hadn't had the persistence to go out and find that Torah he's proudly holding, it would just never have happened. I also wanted to give a shout out to a few of the people who worked on the film, if that's appropriate, and that's time. If there's time, is that okay?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, I appreciate it. So much of the reason people have loved this film as much as they have, and it's made as such an emotional connection with folks, is Billy Novik's original soundtrack. If you don't know Billy, you should look up his website. He's done scores for feature films. It happens to be a tennis buddy, so I was lucky. And the thing about it was a total COVID production. Fortunately, we shot everything and we were just starting to edit when COVID really hit. And that's a great time to be editing. And Billy called me up, I think it was just about 2 years ago, and said, Rob, I'm bored. I need to write. What can I write? So we went through the different emotional pieces we need to hit, the different tempos and so forth, the different parts of the film to hold it together. And he wrote it. And then I edited to what he had written, which is backwards from what usually happens. And so that was just another one of these amazing things, like Jeff was saying, that it happened to be the perfect time to read it, that it happened to be Hanukkah after he'd fixed the Hubble, which was an amazing little part of the story. And just while I do have the floor, Austin DeBesh's photography and Shady Hartshorn's post-production, polishing up. Arnie Hartchick, who's a GBH guy, did all the final polishing and color correcting. And Jill Jacobson did the narrating. Heather Merrill did the research, along with my wife, Pam, who also did the interviews. And everybody worked for less than they might normally have done, because everybody, just as Raquel had been struck by the importance of the story, she sort of imbued other people. And I have to give a shout out to Heart Punch Sound Studios, who does all the front lines and all of that stuff. And we could have never afforded them. And Greg gave us a really nice arrangement. So a lot of people, because we couldn't have raised the money to make the film at the quality we wanted to make it. And it just, that was not going to happen. We were just able to get by because so many people believed in it. And I'm really grateful. Thanks for the opportunity, Thea.
Of course. Thank you, Rob. So a slightly different question. Jeff, do you have a favorite Jews in space joke?
Well, the standard one is that if you're really going to perform all of there's a prayer when you get up in the morning, there's a prayer later in the day, there's a prayer every time you eat, there's several prayers, and they all go according to sunrise and sunset. And so the standard joke is the Orthodox rabbi who goes up into space and comes back and he's a physical wreck, and it's because he never got a chance to sleep, because every 90 minutes you get up, you say the morning prayer, then the afternoon prayer, then the evening prayer, and so on and so forth. That's been told many times, but it's still it relates to that earlier question of how do you time your observances, and as I say, you have to make a different set of rules for space flight. There are so many different things that have to be adjusted. As an example, before my first flight, it was occurring during the Jewish holiday of Passover, where we eat matzah instead of regular leavened bread. And so I had some matzah in the crew quarters when we were in quarantine for the week before the flight.
And I asked if I could take some matzah with me up into space, and the woman who was in charge of the food picked up a piece of matzah and broke it. And of course, there's crumbs all over the place, and crumbs in space, bad deal. They don't fall on the floor where you can vacuum them up. They just float where you can breathe them in. And she took a look at all those crumbs and said, that matzah, that's very interesting for your Passover, but it's not going anywhere near space. And so again, you have to make some adjustments. I'm sure there are types of unleavened bread which do not have crumbs, but that'll have to wait for another Passover.
Thank you. I think we'll take as our last question of this wonderful hour we've had together, another one about astronaut culture. That is it a challenge to be proudly human and spiritual in a culture that has so many members of the military? Does being a civilian scientist open up things that maybe military astronauts would not have been able to do?
Not in a spiritual sense. I mean, there's plenty of military people are very religious and probably more observant in their ways than I am. I think there was a reference in the question to the military pilots are all stoic and they're not as humanistic. I mean, in my professional capacity, people always told me they couldn't figure out how I could be so imperturbable, was the word that they used, with all we go through. So, it's a different aspect of every individual's personality. I mean, yeah, there's a humanistic side to me, and it's probably true. I mean, I feel more comfortable talking about some of these things maybe than some of my pilot colleagues did. And, typically when we get people who would come to the Space Center and, like Oliver Sacks wanted to talk about philosophy and psychology. And so they assigned him to talk with me because I like to talk about that sort of thing. But I didn't find any difficulty relating to the pilots on a human basis. Obviously, they came from a very, very different background that I did. But, when you're in a mission, you're all in it together, and they had their responsibilities and I had my responsibilities. They got to fly the shuttle, and the greatest goal for all of the shuttle pilots was eventually to command a mission and physically land the shuttle. Whereas for me as a mission specialist, I got to do cool things like go out in a spacesuit, which they wouldn't let the pilots do because they were too important. They had to bring the shuttle back home. I guess I was a little more expendable, so I got to go outside in a spacesuit, which for me was the greatest thrill. So yeah, lots of different personalities, but we get together and I will say, at the beginning, when we had this huge influx of scientists, some of the pilots were really wondering, can these people really be astronauts and do all the stuff? But, we proved ourselves. And in the end, I think everybody got along remarkably well. We respected what one another could do. And that's the important thing in teamwork.
Thank you. I think across all the conversation we've had today, I've really been struck by the way that the challenge of space flight sort of amplifies and concentrates experiences that we have all the time. How do we relate to each other as human beings? How do we meet across differences? And how do we share these moments of the real transcendent? So thank you so much for this invitation into your world. I'm really grateful for this and grateful to
Been a pleasure. I'm delighted to have been able to share it with members of the MIT community. So thanks for organizing this.
Thank you, Jonathan, for getting us started, making this happen, and Raquel and Rob for your incredible work. And I must thank Christina English and our office, who, as always, brings clarity and calm to all things. So thank you for everyone for joining us. We will wrap up for today.